Part 1, Section 3, Personal History.
People who know me will tell you I really don't talk about myself, let alone talk, as I'm usually quiet and introverted. However, I am by nature a teacher, and I have a few personal stories that I only tell when they are relevant and when I feel others are receptive. Years ago, there used to be a TV commercial that asked, "You got the mots?" When I tell a story, I have to make clear whether or not you got the mots. M-O-T-S, also known as the moral of the story. When I refer to the term dojo, or place of the way, there are two main components that I think and feel make up a dojo. The first is the way, or whatever is being transmitted is considered so important it can be a matter of life and death. The second is the lineage, the continuing transmission of knowledge and experience for the long-term survival for the next generations. Also, so that the future generations can build on and add to that knowledge and experience and continue to adapt and thrive. Museums in Japan contain plenty of densho of ryu or lineages that no longer exist. This densho isn't just for you, but for my great-grandchildren and so on. At the nature school I used to teach at, I would tell others that I was born and raised Roman Catholic, so you can imagine all the guilt I carry. But you may have also heard this traditional advice, which I will paraphrase and then add my own line to. If you give a person a fish, you feed them for a day. If you teach a person how to fish, you feed him for the rest of his life. Now, my line goes, if you teach a person to teach how to fish, you feed his whole community forever. I call this the grandparent perspective of teaching. I feel it is a more long-term, sustainable way of transmission of life-supporting skills and knowledge. In my early years of training in the Bujinkan, sometime in the mid to late 1980s, my sensei, Jack Hoban, once said to me during training that it is immoral and unethical to tell somebody what to do without also telling them why and, if necessary, how to do it. If we begin with how and why the Friction Fire Dojo was created, then we have to begin with understanding its founder. The word sensei is made up of two characters. Sen means before, and sei means life. So together they mean a person who has life experience. So who is Sensei Joe Lau? Since I'm trying to teach from the grandparent perspective that I mentioned earlier, I will start with my great-grandparents. This is my grandmother on my father's side, Kyu Yoon. Her English name was Annie. She was one of 8 children born in Honolulu, Hawaii. Her parents immigrated from Canton or Guangzhou, China, which is where Hong Kong is, to Hawaii when they were young adults and got married. Great-grandfather was a farmer who took his own produce to the markets. This is my grandfather on my father's side, Kwai Lau. His English name was Henry, which is my middle name. He immigrated from Canton, China to Hawaii as a teenager. They got married and he was a businessman importing goods from China. So together they had 4 children, 3 girls and a boy, which was my father, Sun Hing Lau. My grandfather passed away while my father was in medical school, so I never got to meet him. My grandmother, or Popo, we called her, I only met her a few times as she lived in Hawaii. I'll always remember how she pushed hard for me to get the best education possible. This is my grandmother on my mother's side, Tana Ingracia, sitting with my mom and us in Staten Island. Her mother was Incenza Saforita, whose claim to fame was she designed and made clothes for the local people after she learned to sew, read, and write at a convent school. She married a bootmaker named Alfonso Pamela, and she once told me she was baptized in the same church in Corleone, Sicily, the one the character Michael is seen getting married in the movie The Godfather. And then she showed me the picture of the church in her album. Along that line, she told me somebody got shot and they immigrated to the Bronx, New York. And when they arrived, she was 7 years old and didn't speak any English. This is my grandfather on my mother's side, John Ingracia. His father was an iron worker making decorative gates and fences. He met Rose Didone, got married, and they immigrated from Palermo, Sicily, also to the Bronx, New York, and no one was shot. So John Ingracia met Tana Pomia in the Bronx during the time of the Great Depression, and they got married. Together they had 6 kids, the oldest of which was my mother, Joan Ingracia. My grandfather was a strong man. He drove a truck and was a mover for a living. He eventually developed a debilitating case of shingles in his right arm. He died soon after breaking his hip, as many elderly do. My grandmother outlived her husband, and also 5 out of 6 of her children, including my mother, each died of something incurable. She got to see my son Jacob before she passed away. So what is the Mats concerning all my grand and great-grandparents? Well, when I used to teach fire at the nature school, I would ask the students, ask yourself why you came here and why you're learning these skills. Be as clear and specific with yourself as you can. I would then tell them, you have to picture our ancestors trying to cross the glacial Bering Strait land bridge thousands of years ago. You have to picture what the losses were and how many were children. This is the purpose and function of the skills you came here to learn. Friction fire wasn't discovered because some of them were bored on a Saturday night. They didn't try rubbing sticks together because it was a cool thing to do. It was the difference between everyone and yourself living or dying. The purpose and function of martial arts is to protect and defend others and then yourself. Such things have now become sports and entertainment. We need to be careful these skills do not fall not just into the same fate, but obscurity as well. I would try then to further clarify with a story from the Bujinkan Dojo. I heard this story straight from my sensei, Jack Hoban himself. At one of the many large seminars at which we host Hatsumi Sensei, he was once asked a question by a student, which was, "Sensei, what is Kuji?" Kuji is the traditional spiritual protection practice of our martial arts training. I will paraphrase his reply. He said to the effect, "I will tell you what the essence of Kuji is instead. Kuji was born in the tear of a parent's eye who had watched their child die, and they had to go on living." So, along with my great-grandparents' adventures in adversity and the unknown, my father's mother had to endure outliving her son and husband, and my mother's mother had to endure outliving 5 out of 6 of her children and her husband. So this too is the essential lineage of the Friction Fire Dojo. So my father, Dr. Sun Hing Lau, was 100% Cantonese Chinese, born in Hawaii. He was the youngest of 4 children and the only boy. My father inherited his lifelong asthma from his mother and her side of the family. On December 7th, 1942, on a Sunday, he was 16 years old and walking home from the bakery when he saw the Japanese Zeros fly over toward Pearl Harbor and ran home. He always wanted to be a pilot, and he made and collected model airplanes so he knew what they were. His mother said it was probably the Navy doing practice. A few minutes later, they heard the explosions. Later, he went to the mainland and went through medical school in St. Louis, Missouri. His father passed away while he was at school. He went on to do an internship in New York. He had also joined the Navy and was honorably discharged later as a lieutenant commander. He went on to do research cardiac catheterization and became a senior surgeon at the U.S. Public Health Service Hospital in Staten Island, New York, which is now St. Vincent's. His research was also highly published in many medical journals. My father told me he smoked since he was a teenager and couldn't stop. In 1981, while visiting at my grandmother's on my mother's side in upstate New York, he suffered his first heart attack. He knew he was having one and told us he needed to get to a hospital right away. He told us later, in his hospital room, that he had gone into a 3rd-degree heart block and required an internal pacemaker. They apparently did 3 failed attempts to insert the catheter lead when he finally had to tell them how to do it. He recovered well until the next year in 1982, when he died suddenly in the night of another heart attack. I was a high school freshman of 14 years old, and my brother was 12 at the time. My mother, Joan Ingracia Lau, was 100% Sicilian and the oldest of 6 children. At some point in her early years, she acquired strep. She later easily got short of breath on exertion. At 15 years old, she was given an EKG and found to be in an abnormal rhythm. One day, she went to the hospital when she didn't feel well and was diagnosed with rheumatic fever by my father, who was chief resident at the time, after another resident had misdiagnosed her. They later dated for a long time and got married in 1966 after his discharge from the Navy. She eventually needed new artificial heart valves destroyed by the disease. You heard the valves click when the room was quiet or standing close to her. I once asked her if it bothered her. She said she didn't notice it anymore. She spent the rest of her life on cardiac medications, and she eventually would have had 2 more open heart surgeries for replacements. As the oldest child, she survived 4 out of her 5 siblings. She loved my father very much and never got over his passing. It affected her in a multiple of ways, which made it worse. She had to go back to school to find work to support us. She kept her living will and last will updated. And 12 years later, after my father's death, she succumbed to complications, was taken off life support, and passed in 1994. So what are the mots concerning my parents? I will never forget the emotional and financial global family devastation caused by my father's early parting. Using my ER nurse training, I do what I can to stay healthy and long-term functional for my family's sustainability, and I have never smoked, drank, or abused drugs of any kind. Like the catheterization story, I also became a certified asthma educator, not only to educate others so they can learn from my mistakes, but to keep control of my own disease. Like my father, who left behind his 4 large binders of published research, I too will leave behind some kind of densho. After all, what good is it to learn all you can in life and not pass it on to your children, and later, theirs? Joseph Henry Lau, or Joe Lau, one word, to all his friends, was born in Staten Island, New York in 1968. My brother David was born a year and a half later. The most character-building aspect of my life began early with my inherited moderate to severe type asthma from my father's mother's side. I have all my earliest medical records which tell of my chronic hospitalizations, which led to a lot of why questions early in life. My brother seemed to inherit my mother's genes and had no signs of asthma. My folks modeled what it meant to be great parents and providers. My father, who was a Navy man and a doctor, modeled the protector and healer as well. They were my first heroes, just like Batman. As a hobby, my father built and collected antique engine model airplanes, which I helped build a few, but he taught me early the ideas of tinkering and fixing, which is how cardiac catheterization goes as well. All the why questions led to an insatiable curiosity of the big picture, and that led me to nature. Explorations in the woods and streams after we moved to New Jersey eventually got me into one of our greatest worldwide organizations to ever exist, Scouting. It was in Scouting I found where humans get to develop a relationship with nature along with a strong moral and ethical base. I first saw and learned my first firekeeping methods from Scouting. Scouting is quite broad in general, which is great for character building the young mind. However, I couldn't get enough of nature studies and skills. Not surprisingly for a young boy, another important factor was a fascination with martial arts. I started karate at 11 years old and enjoyed it for many years. Hungry for more information, I loved going to the library. It also gave me focus after my father died. It was there I found some books about a nature skills school that was 45 minutes west from where I lived. Then, in 1984, I read in a martial art magazine that an instructor that I wanted to train under was only 45 minutes south of where I lived. In February of 1985, at 16 years old, I began training under Jack Hoban of the Bujinkan Buyu Dojo under Hatsumi Sensei. Back then, our art was called Ninpo Taijutsu, also known as Way of Perseverance Body Methods. In August of 1985, now 17 years old, I attended my first of many classes at the Nature Skills School. There was a lot of teaching, but not a lot of training. Mostly things were homework. During my years of training under Jack Hoban, he would bring around his old college professor, Dr. Robert L. Humphrey, who would become one of the most influential teachers of my life. Together, they wrote a book on his life's work, which to date is still my most recommended one. The quick bio on Humphrey was he was a World War II Iwo Jima Marine, who then worked worldwide with his discoveries and theories to help resolve cross-cultural conflict and ugly Americanism during the Cold War. A real warrior. Here's Humphrey, back in 1996. I took this footage myself. Here, just listen to this. I'll let him speak for himself.
What you have to remember is when the chips are really down in this world, when life is at stake, it's in our guts to look after others, even to the point of giving your life if necessary. You can't trust yourself not to. The way we make the world better is just to expand that circle.
In 1996, I began working as an instructor at the Nature Skills School and began teaching thousands of others how to troubleshoot friction fire methods along with other skills. At age 29, many things happened in 1997. I had my first of many trips to Japan to not only train with Hatsumi Sensei, but teach nature skills in Japan too. Raquel, my fiancée, started working with me in the school's office. We hosted Hatsumi Sensei in New Jersey that year, and I tested and received my 5th Dan, or black belt degree. I became the senior instructor at the Nature School. At the Nature School, I also began teaching workshops on warriorship ethics and the art of the spear, or lance. And sadly, and lastly, we lost Dr. Robert L. Humphrey. In 2001, after Raquel and I got married, we bought a house. I stopped teaching at the school and became the webmaster and assistant manager to my wife, who was now manager in the office, so I could attend nursing school after I had become an EMT. Through my Human Nature Institute and Bujinkan Buyu Shizenho Dojo, I also began to teach workshops in protecting and defending others and nature skills like friction fire, stone tools, and primitive cooking. In 2002, our first of 2 children, Jacob, was born. In 2003, the school decided to move to southern New Jersey, where classes were mainly held. I was approached by the owner of the school if the office could be moved into our house. I agreed, and we rented out our first home and bought another. A lot happened in 2005 as well. I directed the first official international classes run by the Nature School in their native languages of German and Japanese. I graduated nursing school and received my registered nursing license. We then were told by the nature school there was no money to pay employees and run an office. They laid off the whole office, including myself and my wife, who was pregnant with our second child at the time. After 20 years, no severance, no insurance, no salaries, with 2 mortgages and bills. I immediately started working at a local emergency room, which was the only nursing field I wanted to work. A year later, we lost the new house. I started work at another emergency room, working 6 to 7 days a week of 12-hour shifts to make ends meet for about 2 years. But being all too late, and like millions of others in this economic downturn, we filed for protection, but we keep going. To date, we have 2 happy, healthy, troublemaking kids. I still work in an ER while Raquel takes care of the children and runs a travel agency service out of our home. I have also gone on to become a certified asthma educator. I still train and teach under Jack Hoban in Spring Lake, New Jersey, having received my 14th Dan degree under Hatsumi Sensei. And I also teach how to deal with behavioral emergencies in healthcare at Jack Hoban's Resolution Group International. So what are the MOTS, morals of the stories, concerning all those? Some good, some not so good life experiences, all character building. Those lessons lead me to the Tao of Lao, which is the next section. Ganbarimashou. Let's keep going.